In the grim darkness of the far future, there exists a paradox that has puzzled Imperial strategists and confounded even the most learned scholars of Xenos behavior. The orcs, those green-skinned monstrosities who live only for war, who charge headlong into the guns of Space Marine battle lines with gleeful abandon, who consider retreat merely a tactical pause before coming back for another go, have learned to avoid direct confrontation with a particular breed of humanity, not the gene-enhanced warriors of the Adeptus Astartes, not the mechanized death dealers of the Adeptus Mechanicus, but rather baseline humans from a single death world called Catachan. This is the story of why the most war-hungry species in the galaxy has learned to give the Catachan jungle fighters a wide berth, and what this reveals about both the nature of orc psychology and the absolutely terrifying capabilities of soldiers forged in humanity's most hostile environment. The orcs are perhaps the simplest species in the galaxy to understand, at least on the surface. They exist for war. Their entire biology, from their fungal reproductive cycle to their gestalt psychic field, has been engineered around the singular purpose of fighting. An orc's greatest joy is found in battle, their highest honor achieved through combat, and their social hierarchy determined entirely by who can hit the hardest and survive the longest. They are creatures of pure, distilled aggression, given form and crude intelligence. So when we discover that these same orcs, who will happily charge into the guns of fortified Imperial Guard positions, who consider fighting Necrons a good laugh, and who view tyrannid swarms as target-rich environments, actively avoid engaging the Catachan jungle fighters in their preferred terrain, we must ask ourselves, what could possibly make an orc hesitate? What combination of factors could override the most fundamental drive in orc biology, the urge to fight? The answer, as we shall discover, lies not in supernatural terror or overwhelming firepower, but in something far more insidious. It lies in the cold calculation that even the most successful orc warbosses must make, weighing the glory of battle against the reality of fighting an enemy who refuses to die conveniently, who strikes from everywhere and nowhere, and who turns the very environment itself into a weapon of mass destruction. Understanding the orc mindset. To comprehend why Catachans represent such a unique problem for orc warbosses, we must first understand how an orc thinks, what drives their behavior, and how their society functions. The orcs are not mindless berserkers, despite what their reputation might suggest. They operate according to a clear logic, albeit one that seems alien to human sensibilities. At the core of orc psychology lies a beautifully simple principle: might makes right, and size equals respect. An orc grows throughout its life, becoming larger, stronger, and more powerful with each victory it achieves. This is not merely metaphorical. Orcs actually undergo physical changes based on their success in combat. A boy who survives multiple battles and emerges victorious will notice his muscles bulking up, his confidence soaring, and other orcs naturally beginning to defer to him. This process creates a self-reinforcing cycle where success breeds physical dominance, which breeds more success, which breeds greater size and strength. This biological reality shapes everything about orc society. Leadership is not inherited or elected. It is seized through brute force and maintained through constant demonstration of superiority. A nob becomes a nob because he is bigger and meaner than the boys around him. A warboss rises to power because he can beat any nob who challenges him. And a warlord commands multiple tribes because his reputation for violence precedes him so thoroughly that other warbosses choose to follow rather than fight. But here is where the picture becomes more nuanced. While orcs live for fighting, they are not actually suicidal. They possess a survival instinct, albeit one filtered through their unique cultural lens. An orc will retreat from a battle if the situation becomes hopeless, but crucially, they do not view this as defeat. In orc logic, running away simply means they can come back later for another try. As the orc saying goes, If we win, we win. If we die fighting so it doesn't count. If we run for it, we don't lose neither, because we can come back for another go. This attitude toward retreat reveals something vital about orc psychology. They are not driven by a death wish or a desire for martyrdom. They are driven by a love of fighting itself. The combat is the point, not necessarily the dying. An orc who gets killed in battle accepts this as a natural outcome, but given the choice, they would prefer to survive and fight again tomorrow. This preference for survival over pointless death becomes critically important when we consider how they evaluate whether a fight is worth having. The orcs also possess something called the Wah energy, a gestalt psychic field generated by large groups of orcs that actually warps reality in subtle ways. When many orcs gather together, their collective belief and enthusiasm creates a tangible force that bolsters their confidence and even makes their ramshackle technology work better than it has any right to. This psychic phenomenon means that orcs become dramatically more dangerous and more confident when they fight in large groups. The sound of thousands of orcs bellowing their war cries, the sight of a green tide sweeping across the battlefield, these things feed back into the Wah energy and create a snowball effect of aggression and violence. But here is the critical vulnerability in this system. The Wah energy requires proximity and awareness. An orc fighting alongside his fellows, hearing their roars and seeing their successes, draws strength from the collective. An orc isolated, cut off from his mob, fighting alone against an enemy he cannot see or hear, receives no such benefit. In fact, isolation actively undermines an orc's confidence because it separates him from the very thing that makes orcs psychologically dominant, their sense of collective invincibility. Orc warbosses, particularly successful ones, understand these dynamics instinctively. They may not articulate it in human terms, but they know that their boys fight best when they are together, when they can see the enemy, and when they can achieve clear, visible victories. They know that morale, even among orcs, is a resource that must be managed. A warboss who leads his boys into situation after situation where they die without glory, where they cannot see or reach the enemy, where their deaths accomplish nothing. That warboss will soon find himself facing challenges from ambitious knobs who question his leadership. This brings us to the most sophisticated aspect of orc leadership, the political calculation. A warboss maintains his position not just through personal combat prowess, but through his ability to provide his followers with opportunities for violence and victory. An orc follows a particular warboss because that warboss leads them to good fights, to plunder, to glory. If a warboss consistently leads his boys into meat grinders where they die uselessly, where they cannot even properly fight back, the other orcs will begin to question whether this warboss is truly the biggest and best. Successful warbosses, the ones who rise to command entire war forces spanning multiple star systems, are those who have demonstrated an instinctive grasp of these dynamics. They know how to pick their battles. They understand that some targets are easier than others, and that spending their boys' lives on a difficult target when easier prey exists nearby is simply bad leadership. These warbosses have survived long enough and fought smart enough to have developed what humans would recognize as tactical acumen, the ability to evaluate a potential engagement and decide whether the likely outcome justifies the cost. And this is where the Catachan jungle fighters enter the equation as a problem that even the most enthusiastic orc warboss must carefully consider. Because fighting Catachans in their preferred terrain represents exactly the kind of engagement that violates every principle of good orc leadership. It separates the boys from each other, negating the Wah energy. It prevents them from seeing or reaching the enemy, denying them the joy of combat. It kills them without glory, offering none of the satisfaction that makes orc losses acceptable. And most damningly of all, it does not play to any of the orcs' natural advantages, while simultaneously highlighting all of their weaknesses. The Death World Forge. To understand what makes the Catachan jungle fighters so uniquely suited to countering orcs, we must travel to their homeworld and witness the forge in which these warriors are tempered. Catachan is not merely a dangerous planet. It is arguably the single most hostile environment to human life in the entire Imperium, a designation that carries profound weight when you consider that the Imperium spans 1 million worlds across the galaxy. Catachan is a jungle world, but to call it merely a jungle is to fail to grasp the magnitude of its lethality. This is a planet where every single element of the ecosystem has evolved, or more accurately been bioengineered, to kill. Every animal species is carnivorous. Every plant species is poisonous. The very air teems with microorganisms that can cause infection from the smallest scratch. The water is home to predators that can strip flesh from bone in seconds. Even the ground itself seems to hunger for human blood, hiding sinkholes, toxic spores, and burrowing creatures that wait for the vibration of footsteps. The statistics of survival on Catachan paint a picture of such extreme Darwinian selection that it seems almost impossible that humans could maintain a population there at all. 50% of children born on Catachan do not survive infancy. Of those who survive infancy, 50% do not live past the age of 10 years. Think about what this means. 3 out of every 4 children born on Catachan die before they reach adolescence. And these deaths do not come from disease or malnutrition in the traditional sense. They come from the planet actively trying to kill them every single day in 1,000 different ways. Those who do survive to adulthood emerge from this crucible as something more than ordinary humans, not enhanced in the sense of space marines or other augmented warriors, but transformed through the simple mechanism of survival of the fittest. Catachans who reach maturity are invariably taller, stronger, and tougher than baseline humans. Their muscles, developed through constant physical exertion in high-gravity conditions and against deadly resistance, give them a physique that earns them the nickname Baby Ogrins among other Imperial Guard regiments, a comparison to the abhuman Ogrin subspecies known for their massive size and strength. But the physical advantages are only part of the equation. What truly sets Catachans apart is the psychological and mental conditioning that comes from growing up on a world where every moment of inattention can mean death. Catachan children learn to shoot before they can walk properly, not as a figure of speech, but as literal survival necessity. They learn to identify hundreds of different toxic plants by sight and smell. They develop an almost supernatural awareness of their surroundings, able to detect the subtle signs that indicate a predator's presence or a plant's dangerous nature. They learn to move silently through dense jungle, to set traps, to hunt creatures that could kill a space marine, and to do all of this before they reach the age at which most Imperial citizens would be starting basic education. The famous creatures of Catachan become almost legendary in their lethality, and understanding them helps us understand what Catachans learn to overcome. The Catachan Devil, the apex predator for which the elite soldiers are named, is a creature that can eviscerate a fully armored human in seconds. The Catachan barking toad, despite its harmless-sounding name, explodes when threatened, releasing toxic gases that can kill anything in a wide radius. Brainleaf plants use psychic attacks to paralyze prey before dissolving them with acid. Heretic ants inject venom so powerful that a single bite can hospitalize a grown adult for a month. 2 bites give you perhaps a day to find treatment, and 3 simply kill you outright. Even space marines, the Emperor's finest warriors, gene-enhanced to be the ultimate soldiers, are said to avoid Catachan when possible. This is not due to any lack of courage on their part. Rather, it is a calculated assessment that deploying to Catachan represents an inefficient use of these extremely valuable assets. The planet's environment is so hostile that even space marines, with their enhanced durability and resistance to toxins, face significant danger from simply being there. There are battles to be fought across the galaxy that better utilize their capabilities, So why waste them on a world that would challenge them without even adding any enemies to the equation? For the native Catachans, however, this environment is simply home. They do not view their planet as unusually dangerous because they have no reference point for anything else. From their perspective, the most suicidal military engagements they face while serving in the Astra Militarum are less dangerous than a typical day back home. This is not bravado or exaggeration. It is simple fact. A Catachan soldier who survives to recruitment age has already faced and overcome challenges that would kill most humans from other worlds. They have outsmarted, outfought, and outlasted predators. That evolution or ancient bioengineering designed to be perfect killing machines. This creates a fundamental shift in how Catachans approach warfare. While soldiers from other regiments must be trained to suppress their survival instincts, to charge into gunfire and face horrors that their minds rebel against, Catachans face a different psychological calculus. They genuinely believe that no battlefield in the galaxy can be more dangerous than their homeworld. And crucially, they are probably right. When you have spent your entire life evading ambush predators that can sense your heartbeat from 30 meters away, dodging plants that explode when touched, and surviving in an environment where a moment's lapse in attention means death, the prospect of facing enemy soldiers, even orcs, seems almost manageable by comparison. The Catachan personality reflects this background. They exhibit a gung-ho, fearless attitude that other regiments sometimes mistake for recklessness. But it is not recklessness. It is the confidence of people who have survived the unsurvivable, who have been tested every day of their lives and found equal to the challenge. They display a stubborn refusal to give up, because giving up on Catachan means death. So the concept of surrender or retreat in the face of ordinary enemies seems almost absurd to them. Interestingly, this supreme confidence and capability also shapes their relationship with authority in ways that cause tension within the rigid hierarchy of the Imperial Guard. Catachan officers lead from the front and share in the hardships of their troops, because on Catachan, that is how you maintain respect. Leaders who demand privilege or hide behind their rank do not survive long on a death world. This translates into a regimental culture where discipline is maintained through earned respect rather than fear of punishment, and where commissars, the political officers assigned to enforce loyalty, often find themselves facing accidents in the field if they push too hard. But perhaps the most significant aspect of the Catachan experience is how it prepares them specifically for the kind of warfare that orcs find most frustrating and demoralizing. Orcs thrive on direct confrontation, on the thunder of gunfire and the clash of close combat. They want to see their enemies, to fight them face to face, to feel the satisfaction of a skull caved in by a power claw or riddled with slugs from a shooter. Catachans, by contrast, have spent their entire lives fighting enemies they often could not see until it was almost too late. They have learned that survival means attacking from ambush, using the terrain to their advantage, striking and fading before the enemy can respond. They have internalized the principles of guerrilla warfare not through military training, but through simple, evolutionary necessity. When a Catachan regiment deploys to a jungle world, or really any terrain with dense vegetation and difficult sightlines, they are not adapting to unfamiliar conditions. They are returning to their element. The environment that would slow and confuse other regiments is home territory for them. The sounds, the smells, the feeling of moving through dense foliage, all of this is as natural to them as walking down a hive city street would be to a Cadian. And in this environment, against enemies who rely on numerical superiority and frontal assault, Catachans become something truly terrifying. Masters of the shadows. The combat doctrine of the Catachan jungle fighters is not something taught from manuals or developed in war colleges. It is an organic evolution of the survival strategies that kept their ancestors alive on a planet trying to kill them. When the Departamento Munitorum first raised regiments from Catachan, They did not need to train these soldiers in the fundamentals of warfare. They simply needed to give them guns and point them at the enemy. Everything else, the tactics, the fieldcraft, the killer instinct, was already there. At the heart of Catachan tactical doctrine lies a fundamental principle: never fight fair. This is not cowardice or dishonor. It is simple pragmatism, learned from a lifetime of facing enemies that possessed natural advantages in strength, speed, or lethality. On Catachan, fighting fair meant fighting stupid, and fighting stupid meant dying. You ambushed. You used traps. You struck when and where the enemy was most vulnerable, and you disappeared before they could retaliate. These same principles, when applied to military operations against conventional enemies, proved devastatingly effective. The Catachan ambush is an art form refined over generations. It begins with observation and patience. Catachan scouts will position themselves days before an expected enemy movement, camouflaging themselves so thoroughly that they might as well be part of the jungle itself. They will watch, wait, and learn the enemy's patterns, their habits, their weaknesses. They note when guards change shifts, when commanders sleep, when discipline becomes lax. All of this information feeds into the planning of an ambush that will achieve maximum casualties with minimum risk to the Catachans themselves. When the ambush is sprung, it comes from multiple directions simultaneously, creating a kill zone where every angle is covered by Catachan fire. The first indication that an enemy force has walked into a Catachan ambush is usually the violent deaths of their leaders, taken out by sniper fire at ranges that make retaliation impossible. Then comes the roar of heavy bolters and the whoosh of flamers, saturating the kill zone with fire. Demolition charges detonate, turning carefully prepared sections of terrain into blast zones that shred anyone nearby. All of this happens in the space of seconds, overwhelming the enemy before they can react. But what makes a Catachan ambush truly deadly is not just the initial violence, but the controlled chaos that follows. As the enemy reels from the first assault, trying to identify where the attack is coming from, Catachan infantry close in with knives and close-range weapons. The Catachan knife, particularly the variants like the Devil's Claw, are weapons of terrifying efficiency. These blades, often coated with toxins, harvested from Catachan's lethal fauna, can kill with a single slash. In the hands of warriors who have spent their lives fighting at close quarters, they become extensions of the killer's will. The use of demolition charges deserves special attention because it represents a Catachan specialty. Where other regiments might use demo charges sparingly, treating them as special weapons requiring careful handling, Catachans use them with abandon. They have little regard for the volatile nature of these explosives, because the most dangerous thing they handled this week was probably the ration they ate for breakfast, prepared from Catachan food stocks that would poison most other humans. Catachans will rig entire sections of jungle with explosives, creating daisy chains of destruction that can be triggered remotely or through tripwires invisible to the enemy. Against enemies like orcs, who rely on mass assault tactics, these demolition charge arrays become force multipliers of incredible effectiveness. A single Catachan squad, given time to prepare the battlefield, can channel orc advances into predetermined kill zones, where a series of coordinated detonations will kill hundreds. The explosions do not even need to destroy all the orcs. They simply need to break up the mob formations, separate the boys from each other, and create opportunities for the Catachans to engage smaller groups on more favorable terms. Catachan snipers represent another layer of this multifaceted approach to warfare. These individuals are not merely skilled marksmen. They are patient hunters who will take up position hours or even days before an engagement, concealing themselves so effectively that they remain undetected even when fighting rages around them. Their preferred targets are enemy leaders and specialists, the officers who provide direction, the heavy weapons teams that threaten Catachan positions, the shamans or weird boys whose abilities can turn the tide of battle. A Catachan sniper thinks nothing of waiting motionless in a tree for 6 hours to get a single shot at a high-value target. And when that shot comes, it rarely misses. The toxins that Catachans routinely apply to their weapons, both bullets and blades, amplify this effectiveness. These venoms, harvested from Catachan's lethal ecosystem, can kill creatures several times larger than humans with single doses. Applied to sniper rounds or knife blades, they ensure that even a glancing wound becomes fatal. An orc nob hit by a Catachan sniper round might initially shrug off what seems like a minor wound, only to collapse minutes later as the toxins ravage his system. This delayed lethality creates psychological uncertainty among enemies, making even minor wounds something to fear. In close quarters combat, Catachans fight with a savage efficiency that belies their baseline human status. They are not enhanced warriors in the sense of Space Marines or even Tempestus Scions, but what they possess is something potentially more valuable: the instinctive understanding of how to kill that comes from growing up on a world where hesitation means death. They know where to strike to disable, where to cut to bleed, how to use leverage against larger opponents. They have fought creatures stronger and faster than orcs, and survived by being smarter and more vicious. The tactical flexibility that characterizes Catachan operations stems from this instinctive approach to warfare. Where other regiments rely on rigid doctrines and predetermined battle plans, Catachans adapt fluidly to changing circumstances. If an ambush fails to achieve complete surprise, they fade back into cover, rather than pressing an unfavorable engagement. If the enemy proves stronger than expected, they trade space for time, leading the enemy into progressively more dangerous terrain while whittling them down with hit-and-run attacks. They have no attachment to holding specific positions or achieving objectives by specific means. They care only about surviving and killing the enemy in whatever way proves most efficient. This approach to warfare extends to how Catachans use the environment itself as a weapon. They are masters at leveraging terrain advantages, using dense jungle to break up enemy formations, channeling attacks through narrow paths that become death traps, and positioning themselves on high ground where they can observe and fire without being easily reached. But they go beyond passive use of terrain. Catachans actively manipulate the environment, rigging trees to fall on advancing enemies, contaminating water sources, even releasing or attracting local predators and directing them toward enemy positions. Against conventional enemies, this doctrine of ambush, attrition, and area denial proves highly effective. Against orcs, it becomes something close to a perfect counter. Because everything about Catachan tactics is designed to deny the enemy exactly what orcs need most: a clear target, the ability to group up, and the opportunity for glorious close combat. Instead of the straightforward battle that orcs crave, fighting Catachans becomes a nightmare of invisible death, exploding trees, and enemies who refuse to stand and fight. It transforms war from the joyful chaos that orcs live for into a grinding, frustrating experience where the thrill of battle is replaced by the paranoia of never knowing where the next attack will come from. Historical encounters, the strategic wisdom that leads modern orc warbosses to avoid Catachan forces, did not emerge from nowhere. It has been written in blood and hard-learned lessons across multiple campaigns where greenskins encountered these Death World warriors and came to regret the meeting. By examining several of these historical conflicts, we can see the pattern that has shaped orc attitudes toward Catachans and understand why even the most aggressive warbosses now think twice before engaging them in suitable terrain. The Third War for Armageddon provides perhaps the clearest example of how Catachans operate against orcs in their preferred environment. When the forces of warlord Gazgakul Mag Uruk Thraka descended upon Armageddon, the planet's equatorial jungles became a key battleground. These jungles, infested with feral orcs who had survived from previous invasions, represented a constant threat to Imperial supply lines and rear areas. Conventional Imperial Guard regiments struggled in this environment, taking heavy casualties in ambushes and finding it difficult to bring their superior firepower to bear effectively. Enter the Catachans. Commissar Yarrick, demonstrating the tactical acumen that made him legendary, realized that soldiers from Catachan would be uniquely suited to combat in Armageddon's jungles. He was not wrong. When Catachan regiments deployed to the equatorial regions, they adapted to the environment so quickly that many of the soldiers described patrolling the orc-infested jungles as akin to paid leave compared to their homeworld. This was not bravado. The jungles of Armageddon, while dangerous, simply could not compare to Catachan in lethality. The orcs in these jungles, feral orcs who had lived there for generations and knew the terrain intimately, suddenly found themselves facing humans who knew the jungle better than they did. The Catachans moved through the dense foliage like ghosts, setting ambushes that the orcs blundered into repeatedly. They used their intimate understanding of jungle ecology to predict orc movements, to identify their camps and supply caches, to strike at the most vulnerable moments. The feral orcs, despite outnumbering the Catachans by ratios approaching 30-1, took devastating casualties. Multiple times during this campaign, orc forces completely surrounded Catachan units, cutting them off from their base at Cerberus and leaving them isolated in hostile territory for weeks at a time. High-ranking Imperial officers expected these surrounded units to be annihilated. Instead, the Catachans thrived. Some Imperial commanders even theorized that certain Catachan squads had deliberately allowed themselves to be cut off, content in the knowledge that deep in the jungle, isolated from oversight, they could fight the war their own way. The orcs learned that surrounding a Catachan force did not trap them. It trapped the orcs in the jungle with the Catachans. The Dulmarling cleansing provides another instructive example. When orc forces overran this world, conventional Imperial Guard regiments attempting to make planetfall were slaughtered before they could establish a foothold. The Catachan II Regiment, under the command of the legendary Colonel Ironhand Strachan, was the only regiment to successfully reach the surface. Rather than attempting to fight a conventional war against numerically superior orcs, Strachan immediately adapted his strategy to leverage his regiment's strengths. For an entire year, the Catachan II fought a guerrilla war in the subterranean depths of Dulmarlin's cavern systems. The orcs, who had expected straightforward battles, instead faced an enemy who struck without warning and disappeared before reinforcements could arrive. Catachan scouts mapped the extensive cave networks, identifying choke points and weak points in the cavern ceilings. They sabotaged orc supply lines, assassinated orc leaders, and steadily whittled down the greenskin forces through attrition. The campaign's decisive moment came when Catachan scouts located the center of the orc settlement in the massive underground chamber known as the Mamothian Vault. Strachan personally led a strike force into this fortress, fighting through waves of orcs to plant demolition charges at critical structural points. The resulting collapse buried thousands of orcs under millions of tons of rock, effectively decapitating the orc command structure and breaking the back of their resistance. The fact that Strachan was severely wounded in this final assault and had to be carried from the collapsing cavern by Sly Marbo himself only adds to the legendary status of this campaign. The assault on Cato, though less famous, demonstrates how effective Catachans can be even against more organized orc forces. The world of Cato, shrouded in perpetual twilight due to its stellar position, featured terrible visibility and rough terrain that reduced warfare to a series of bloody skirmishes. The Catachan MX-40, unseen lurkers under Colonel Steel-Eye Black, battled orcs from the Death Skulls clan in conditions that theoretically favored the orcs' superior numbers and aggression. Instead, Colonel Black's tactical brilliance and the Catachan's superior fieldcraft turned what could have been a grinding stalemate into an imperial victory. Catachan Sentinel teams located and destroyed the Orcs' Stomper factory hidden in the Widow Valley, eliminating the Greenskins' advantage in heavy walkers. When the Death Skulls launched an all-out offensive in response, Hoping to overwhelm Imperial forces through sheer ferocity, they ran headlong into a series of carefully prepared Catachan ambushes. Over 3 days of brutal fighting, Colonel Black systematically dissected and destroyed the Orc forces, using the poor visibility that was supposed to aid the Orcs against them instead. These campaigns share common elements that reveal why Orcs have learned to fear Catachans. In each case, the Catachans refused to fight the kind of war that Orcs excel at. They declined to meet massed Orc infantry with their own massed formations. They avoided standing battles where Orc numerical superiority would matter. Instead, they forced the Orcs to fight in conditions that negated every natural advantage the Greenskins possessed, while playing to every strength the Catachans had developed. The psychological impact of these defeats should not be underestimated. Orc culture is fundamentally oral. Stories of great battles and mighty warriors spread rapidly through Orc society, shaping how future generations think about warfare and their enemies. Orcs who survived encounters with Catachans carried those memories back to their tribes. They spoke of enemies who struck from nowhere, of comrades who simply disappeared without a trace, of the growing paranoia that came from fighting an enemy you could not see or predict. These stories, told around campfires and in Orc settlements, gradually built a reputation for Catachans that transcended any single engagement. Crucially, these were not stories of glorious defeats. Orcs can respect an enemy who fights hard and kills many boys, as long as the fight itself was enjoyable. But fighting Catachans was not enjoyable. It was frustrating, terrifying, and fundamentally unsatisfying. Orcs died without seeing their killers. They died from traps and toxins rather than in honest combat. Their bodies were booby-trapped, their supplies poisoned. Their attempts to close with the enemy met with fading retreats that led them into progressively more dangerous ambushes. For Orc Warbosses evaluating whether to attack Catachan-held positions, these historical precedents create a clear picture. Victory is theoretically possible if you are willing to accept massive casualties and a long, grinding campaign with little glory. But the cost-benefit analysis rarely works out in favor of attack. There are easier targets available, enemies who will fight in ways that Orcs find satisfying, where victories can be achieved at acceptable costs. Why waste your best boys fighting Catachans when you could be smashing Space Marine positions or overwhelming Planetary Defense Force regiments instead? The legend of Sly Marbo and the Catachan Devils. If we seek to understand the psychological impact that Catachans have on Orc thinking, we must turn our attention to the legends and heroes that embody everything these Deathworld warriors represent. At the pinnacle of Catachan capability stands Sly Marbo, the one-man army, whose exploits have become so legendary that even enemy commanders doubt whether a single human could accomplish what is attributed to him. Understanding Marbo and the elite Catachan Devils who represent the best of their world helps us grasp why Orcs have learned to fear these warriors. Sly Marbo is, by all accounts, an anomaly, even among Catachans. This is significant, considering that every Catachan who survives to adulthood is already exceptional by normal human standards. Marbo is said to possess the physique of a small orc, his muscles so overdeveloped that they seem almost inhuman. His eyes are described as cold, distant, and utterly dead, the eyes of someone who has seen and done things that would break most people. Between missions, Marbo exhibits a mixture of sadness and brooding, appearing like a hulking machine running on minimal power, conserving energy for the violence to come. The stories surrounding Marbo strain credulity, yet they come from official reports and eyewitness accounts. On Farthest, he allegedly destroyed an entire Tau armored convoy by booby-trapping a ravine, causing dozens of hammerhead gunships to plummet to their destruction. On Sask's world, he captured an enemy command post single-handedly, killing the alien commander and all its bodyguards using only his bare hands and a ration tin. During the Octavius War, it is said he hunted the chameleonic tyrannid lictors, creatures designed to be perfect stealth predators, for sport. Against Orcs specifically, Marbo's record is particularly impressive. and particularly terrifying from a greenskin perspective. During the campaign on Gorak Secundus, under Colonel Straken's command, Marbo was hand-picked to infiltrate a cult of deranged humans who had begun worshipping the orcs as gods. He slaughtered anyone who stood in his path, learned the enemy's plans, and opened the way for a Catachan assault. In the battles that followed, Marbo would appear from nowhere at critical moments, killing orc gun teams, assassinating nobs, and disappearing before the greenskins could react. When Warboss Killscar finally fell to Straken in personal combat, it was Marbo who carried the colonel's broken body from the collapsing battlefield. During the Third War for Armageddon, Marbo waged a one-man war against the orc invaders, operating alone in the planet's industrial wastelands. His skill and experience were such that he accomplished missions that normally would require a dozen elite Imperial assassins. Entire orc companies, forces numbering in the hundreds, found themselves hunted by a single human who struck without warning and vanished like smoke. The jungle fighter caused such havoc that enemy encampments were found abandoned, their occupants either slain or having fled in terror. Even Chaos Space Marines fell to his attacks, their enhanced physiology and power armor proving insufficient protection against Marbo's expertise. What makes Marbo particularly terrifying from an orc perspective is not just his lethality, but his operational methodology. He operates alone, carrying only what he can transport personally. His weapons are relatively simple: a Ripper pistol that fires venomous, armor-piercing shards, and an envenomed Catachan knife coated with toxins so deadly that the smallest cut becomes fatal. Yet with this minimal loadout, Marbo has killed thousands. He has destroyed war machines, assassinated warlords, and sabotaged entire military operations. Enemy commanders have sworn that the devastation attributed to him cannot be the work of a single individual, that entire armies must be responsible for such destruction. The psychological warfare aspect of Marbo's operations cannot be overstated. Orcs who survive encounters with him carry stories back to their tribes. They speak of a human who appears from nowhere, kills with mechanical efficiency, and disappears before you can even react. They describe finding entire squads dead, all killed silently in their sleep, their throats cut so precisely that they never woke up. They recount watching nobs and even warbosses fall to sniper fire from impossible ranges, hit by rounds they never saw coming from a shooter they never detected. For orcs, whose entire culture revolves around visible displays of strength and direct confrontation, Marbo represents something deeply unsettling. He denies them the fight they crave. There is no glorious combat, no testing of strength against strength. There is only death, sudden and unavoidable, delivered by an enemy you cannot see or reach. Worse, from an orc perspective, there is no honor in being killed by Marbo because you never get the chance to fight back. You simply die, often without even knowing you were targeted. The Catachan Devils represent a more broadly distributed version of this same capability. These elite soldiers, the closest thing jungle fighters have to special forces, are drawn from the most skilled and experienced warriors in their regiments. They conduct long-range penetration raids deep behind enemy lines, operating independently for extended periods, while causing maximum disruption to enemy operations. Their senses are so finely honed that they can detect hidden threats even through active camouflage or cloaking devices, a capability that makes them invaluable as scouts and specialists. In Catachan regiments, the Devils fulfill multiple roles. They range ahead of the main force, engaging enemy ambushes before they can strike, launching surprise attacks on vulnerable positions, and setting traps that channel enemy forces into kill zones. They excel at herding enemies into the most dangerous terrain available, using their intimate knowledge of local ecology to maneuver opponents into areas filled with natural hazards. A Devil squad might spend days observing an enemy position, learning its routines and weaknesses, before striking with devastating precision at the moment of maximum vulnerability. Against orcs, The Catachan Devils employ tactics specifically designed to undermine greenskin morale and unit cohesion. They target nobs and warbosses preferentially, understanding that orc forces become less effective when their leadership is decapitated. They sabotage orc vehicles and heavy weapons, depriving the greenskins of assets they have come to rely on. They contaminate orc food stores and water sources with toxins that sicken and kill. They set traps along commonly used orc routes, creating a landscape where every step might trigger a deadly surprise. The cumulative effect of these operations creates a climate of paranoia within orc forces. Where once the orcs felt confident in their territorial control, the presence of Catachan Devils makes nowhere safe. Supply lines that were secure yesterday become ambush sites today. Leaders who swagger through their camps one morning are found dead in their sleep the next. The very environment seems to turn hostile as trees explode, ground collapses, and hidden bombs detonate without warning. This paranoia is particularly destructive to orc morale because it runs counter to everything in their nature. Orcs are not cowards, but they are also not fools. They can recognize when a situation has become untenable. When the deaths mount, when boys start disappearing one by one, when even the biggest and baddest nobs fall to invisible enemies, the natural orc inclination towards self-preservation begins to assert itself. Orcs start looking over their shoulders, jumping at shadows, questioning whether this fight is worth continuing. The legends surrounding Marbo and the Devils spread far beyond the battlefields where they operate. Orcs are great storytellers, and stories of the shadow humies who kill without being seen have propagated through orc culture. These stories grow in the telling, becoming more elaborate and more frightening with each repetition. Some orc tribes speak of Catachans as if they were supernatural entities rather than human soldiers, attributing to them abilities that border on the magical. While these exaggerations are objectively false, the psychological impact is very real. When orcs believe that Catachans are something more than human, something that cannot be fought conventionally, they become less willing to engage them. From a Warbosses perspective, this reputation creates a strategic problem. If your boys already believe that fighting Catachans is certain death, their morale will be compromised before the battle even begins. The Wah energy that normally makes orc forces so effective relies on collective confidence and enthusiasm. If half your boys are looking nervously at the jungle around them, expecting death from shadows, that energy dissipates. The warboss then faces the choice of spending time and effort trying to restore confidence in his troops, or simply pointing them at a different target where their natural aggression and fearlessness will serve them better. Why warbosses calculate differently? The decision-making process of an orc warboss is often misunderstood by Imperial commanders who view orcs as mindless brutes motivated purely by bloodlust. While it is true that orcs live for violence and find joy in battle, the most successful warbosses, the ones who rise to command entire war forces, possess a form of cunning intelligence that allows them to make strategic calculations. Understanding how these warbosses think and why fighting Catachans fails their internal cost-benefit analysis reveals much about both orc psychology and the unique threat posed by Death World warriors. A warboss maintains his position through a delicate balance of power. He must be the biggest, toughest orc in his warband, capable of defeating any challenger in personal combat. But size and strength alone are insufficient for long-term success. A warboss must also demonstrate that following him leads to good fights, plentiful loot, and opportunities for his boys to prove themselves in battle. This creates a form of meritocracy where leadership is tied directly to results. A warboss who consistently leads his followers into unsatisfying battles, where they die without glory or accomplish nothing of value, will quickly face challenges from ambitious nobs who believe they could do better. This political reality shapes how successful warbosses evaluate potential engagements. Every battle represents an investment of resources, primarily the lives of the boys under the warboss's command. Orc biology means that losses can be replaced relatively quickly through their spore-based reproduction, but there is still a finite pool of boys available at any given time. A war boss who expends his forces recklessly may find himself weakened to the point where rivals can successfully challenge his position. Therefore, even the most aggressive war boss must consider whether a particular fight is worth having. The Catachan problem, from a war boss's perspective, begins with the fundamental nature of jungle warfare. Orcs are creatures who thrive on momentum and mass. Their ideal battle involves vast numbers of boys charging forward in a green tide, their collective "wah" energy making them feel invincible as they sweep over enemy positions. In this type of engagement, orc strengths are maximized. Their numbers overwhelm defenders, their crude but effective weapons shred through enemy ranks, and individual losses become insignificant against the joy of communal violence. Jungle warfare against Catachans offers none of these advantages. The dense terrain prevents the formation of cohesive masses, forcing orcs to advance in smaller groups that can navigate through the undergrowth. This immediately undermines the "wah" energy, as orcs who cannot see or hear their fellows lose the psychological reinforcement that makes them so dangerous. The jungle itself becomes an enemy, with visibility reduced to a few meters, sounds muffled by vegetation, and every shadow potentially concealing a threat. In this environment, Catachans hold every advantage. They move through the jungle with ease, while orcs crash through undergrowth like wounded squigoths, advertising their presence to anyone listening. They can see and hear orcs approaching long before the greenskins detect them, allowing perfect preparation for ambushes. They know which paths are safe and which are death traps, information they use to channel orc advances into predetermined kill zones. From a war boss's perspective, sending boys into this environment is like feeding them into a meat grinder where they die without ever reaching the enemy. The casualties that result from fighting Catachans in jungle terrain are not the glorious deaths that make orc losses acceptable. When an orc dies charging a Space Marine battle line, his death is witnessed by his fellows, his bravery noted, his sacrifice contributing to the eventual victory. When an orc dies to a Catachan ambush, he often dies alone, separated from his mob, killed by an enemy he never saw. His body is booby-trapped or left to rot in the jungle. His death accomplishes nothing and inspires no one. These are wasted deaths, and a war boss who produces too many wasted deaths will not remain a war boss for long. The time factor compounds this problem. Orc military strategy, such as it is, typically revolves around speed and momentum. They hit hard, overwhelm the enemy quickly, loot whatever is available, and move on to the next target. Prolonged campaigns that drag on for months or years are anathema to orc psychology because they provide too many opportunities for internal conflict. When orcs are not actively fighting an external enemy, they start fighting each other. A war boss commanding a force bogged down in an endless jungle war against Catachans faces the dual threat of external casualties and internal challenges to his authority. Catachan operations extend conflicts almost indefinitely. Even when orcs achieve tactical victories, occupying Catachan positions or forcing the jungle fighters to retreat, they find no resolution. The Catachans simply fade into the jungle and continue operations from new positions. They ambush supply lines, assassinate leaders, sabotage equipment, and generally make continued occupation unsustainable. An orc force that defeats a Catachan regiment may find itself bleeding personnel daily to attacks they cannot prevent or retaliate against. Victory becomes meaningless when you cannot actually secure the victory. The war boss's calculation becomes simple. If I attack this Catachan position with sufficient force to overwhelm their defenses, I will suffer heavy casualties and spend weeks or months securing the area. During this time, my boys will become demoralized by constant ambushes and invisible enemies. The other war bosses in my war will see my weakness and may challenge my position. The loot and glory gained will not compensate for the costs incurred. Alternatively, I could attack a different target, one where my boys can fight properly, where victories are clear and costs acceptable, and where my reputation will be enhanced rather than diminished. This rational calculus does not mean that orcs never fight Catachans. Sometimes strategic necessity leaves no choice. If Catachans control a critical objective that must be taken, or if they threaten lines of communication that cannot be abandoned, a warboss may determine that the costs of engagement are acceptable compared to the costs of avoidance. Similarly, some warbosses are simply too stupid or too aggressive to make these calculations, throwing their forces against Catachan positions out of sheer belligerence. These warbosses tend not to remain in command for very long. The most successful warbosses, however, learn to recognize Catachan deployments and adjust their strategies accordingly. They probe cautiously, looking for weaknesses or opportunities. If the terrain favors the Catachans too heavily, if the expected casualties seem too high, if alternative targets present themselves, these clever warbosses will redirect their forces. It is not cowardice that drives this decision. It is the cold calculation that some fights are better avoided, and that a warboss who consistently chooses his battles wisely will accumulate more victories and maintain his position longer than one who charges blindly at every enemy. The reputation factor amplifies these calculations. Orc culture spreads stories of successful battles and mighty warriors throughout the greenskin diaspora. A warboss who defeats space marines in open battle gains prestige that attracts more followers. A warboss who successfully wars across multiple systems, crushing resistance and accumulating loot, becomes the stuff of legend. But a warboss who gets his boys killed, fighting Catachans in the jungle, who struggles for months to secure minor objectives against invisible enemies, who presides over a campaign that grinds forward with agonizing slowness, that warboss becomes a cautionary tale rather than an inspiration. This reputational concern creates a selection pressure within orc leadership. Warbosses who regularly engage Catachans in their preferred terrain tend to suffer higher casualties, face more challenges to their authority, and ultimately get replaced by rivals who demonstrate better judgment. The warbosses who survive and prosper are those who learn, either through direct experience or through the stories passed down in orc culture, that fighting Catachans is a poor investment. These successful warbosses pass on their tactical wisdom to the next generation of leaders, either directly through their actions or through the stories that circulate about them. The result is a form of cultural evolution within orc society, where successive generations of warbosses become progressively more cautious about engaging Catachans in jungle warfare. This is not genetic evolution. Individual orcs do not become smarter or more strategic. Rather, it is mimetic evolution, where successful strategies spread through the culture because the warbosses who employ them survive longer and achieve more, making them models to be emulated. The unsuccessful strategies, like recklessly attacking Catachans in dense jungle, get pruned from the collective knowledge base as the warbosses who employ them end up dead or deposed. The jungle nullifies orc strengths. To fully appreciate why orc warbosses avoid engaging Catachans in jungle terrain, we must examine in detail how this environment systematically negates every advantage that makes orcs dangerous while amplifying the strengths of Death World warriors. The jungle is not merely unfavorable terrain for orcs. It is an environment that transforms their greatest assets into liabilities and hands complete tactical dominance to an enemy who was literally born to fight in such conditions. Begin with the most fundamental orc advantage: numerical superiority. Orcs breed rapidly through their spore-based reproductive system, allowing them to replace casualties at rates that conventional enemies cannot match. In open warfare, this numbers advantage is decisive. When thousands of orcs charge across an open field, even heavy weapons fire and disciplined volleys can only kill so many before the green tide crashes into enemy lines. The sheer mass of bodies overwhelms defensive positions, the survivors looting what they can and moving on to the next target. This is orc warfare at its most effective. In jungle terrain, this numerical advantage evaporates. Dense vegetation prevents mass formations from forming or maintaining cohesion. Orcs must advance in small groups, picking their way through undergrowth, around massive tree trunks, through streams and ravines. A warg that might comprise 10,000 boys in open terrain becomes fragmented into hundreds of small mobs, each navigating independently, unable to see or support the others. The psychological effect of this fragmentation cannot be overstated. Each small group of orcs loses the feeling of invincibility that comes from being part of a vast horde, leaving them vulnerable to ambush and demoralization. Catachans, meanwhile, excel at engaging small groups of enemies. A Catachan squad that would be hopelessly outmatched by 100 orcs in open battle can easily ambush and destroy a mob of 10 orcs who stumble into a prepared kill zone. The jungle fighters set up overlapping fields of fire, coordinate their weapons to maximize casualties, and disappear before reinforcements can arrive. They repeat this process dozens of times, whittling down the orc force mob by mob, until what began as a massive invasion becomes a scattered collection of disoriented survivors. Orc vehicles and heavy weapons, which provide critical support in conventional warfare, become almost useless in dense jungle. Battle wagons and trucks cannot navigate through terrain choked with vegetation and broken by ravines. Even if paths can be cleared, the noise and effort required to move these vehicles through jungle advertises their presence to every Catachan within kilometers. The vehicles become slow-moving targets, easily ambushed, their mobility advantage negated by terrain that reduces them to crawling speed. Heavy weapons face similar problems. Orc big shooters and cannons rely on having clear sightlines and the ability to lay down suppressive fire across wide areas. In jungle, where visibility rarely extends beyond a few dozen meters, these weapons lose most of their effectiveness. An orc heavy weapons team might spend hours establishing a position only to discover that the jungle canopy prevents them from covering any meaningful area, and that Catachan snipers have already identified their position and are preparing to eliminate them. The wah energy that powers much of orc psychological and even quasi-supernatural advantage requires proximity and awareness. When orcs fight together in large groups, their collective belief and enthusiasm creates a tangible effect that bolsters their confidence and even makes their equipment function better than it should. This Gestalt psychic field grows stronger as more orcs participate, creating a feedback loop where success breeds confidence, which breeds more success. Jungle warfare against Catachans breaks this cycle completely. Orcs spread out across the terrain cannot see or hear each other, cannot draw strength from their fellows' presence, cannot contribute to or benefit from the collective wah energy. Individual orcs and small groups fight essentially alone, their natural confidence undermined by isolation and the constant threat of ambush. The psychological advantage that makes orcs so dangerous in conventional warfare simply does not manifest in these conditions. Catachans, by contrast, are perfectly comfortable operating independently or in small groups. Their entire culture emphasizes individual capability and self-reliance. A Catachan soldier, separated from his squad, does not panic or lose effectiveness. He continues operating according to his training and instincts, confident in his ability to survive and complete his mission. This psychological resilience gives them an enormous advantage over orcs, who derive their confidence from group belonging. The frontal assault, the core orc tactic that has worked on countless battlefields across the galaxy, becomes suicidal in jungle terrain against a prepared enemy. When orcs charge across open ground, they accept casualties as the price of closing with the enemy. They know that if enough of them survive to reach the enemy lines, their superior close combat capability will carry the day. In jungle, there is no clear path for a charge. There is no enemy line to reach. There are only kill zones and ambush positions, invisible until triggered, from which fire pours out to shred the attacking orcs before fading away. Catachans use the terrain itself to channel orc advances into these kill zones. They block the easiest paths with obstacles both natural and artificial, forcing the orcs into narrower and more dangerous routes. They mine likely approaches with explosives and booby traps. They position themselves to create crossfires where orcs are caught between multiple angles of attack with no cover, and crucially, they never allow themselves to become decisively engaged. If the orcs somehow survive the initial ambush and push forward, they find the Catachans already gone, already establishing the next ambush further back, leading the greenskins deeper into terrain that becomes progressively more hostile. The orc advantage in close combat, one of their few areas of genuine superiority over most enemies, rarely comes into play against Catachans who refuse to allow the range to close. Catachan ambushes occur at carefully selected ranges where their weapons are most effective and where orc close combat specialists cannot easily reach them. If orcs do manage to close the distance, they find that Catachans are no easy prey in melee either. These Deathworld warriors have spent their entire lives fighting at close quarters against creatures more dangerous than orcs. They are experts with their knives, they know where to strike for maximum effect, and they fight with a savage efficiency that respects no rules of engagement. The jungle environment also introduces countless hazards that affect orcs more severely than Catachans. Catachan jungle fighters know which plants are toxic, which terrain features are stable, where local predators make their dens. They use this knowledge defensively, avoiding dangers, and offensively, leading orcs into areas where the environment itself becomes the weapon. An orc pursuing what he thinks is a fleeing enemy might find himself in a nest of venomous serpents, or stepping onto ground that collapses into a concealed pit, or triggering a deadfall that crushes him under tons of vegetation. Orcs, despite their robust physiology, are not immune to environmental hazards. Their regenerative capabilities and tough constitution protect them against many threats, but concentrated toxins, particularly those harvested from Deathworld fauna, can overcome even orc resilience. Catachans routinely employ such toxins on their weapons and in traps, knowing that even a minor wound can become fatal if properly envenomed. The slow death that follows a poisoned injury is particularly demoralizing for orcs, who prefer quick, glorious deaths to lingering demises that sap their strength over hours or days. The cumulative effect of all these factors transforms the jungle from merely difficult terrain into a force multiplier for Catachans and a death trap for orcs. Every advantage that makes orcs dangerous in conventional warfare, their numbers, their vehicles, their aggression, their close combat prowess, becomes irrelevant or actively harmful. Meanwhile, every skill that Catachans have cultivated through generations of survival on their Deathworld, their stealth, their fieldcraft, their understanding of complex ecosystems, their comfort with isolation and independent operations, all of these become decisive advantages. From a Warbosses perspective, the strategic calculus becomes brutally simple. In open terrain or urban environments, or any setting where orcs can leverage their strengths, fighting is profitable. Casualties occur, but victories follow, and the cycle of conquest continues. In jungle terrain against Catachans, fighting is a losing proposition. Casualties mount without corresponding victories, boys die without glory, and the war boss himself becomes vulnerable to challenges from subordinates who question his leadership. No amount of orc enthusiasm or aggression changes this fundamental equation. The jungle belongs to the Catachans, and orcs, who enter it on hostile terms, do so at their peril. The erosion of orc morale. One of the most persistent misconceptions about orcs is that they are utterly fearless, incapable of experiencing the demoralization that affects other species. This belief stems from observing orcs in their element, charging into the heaviest fire with apparent disregard for casualties, laughing in the face of death, treating the most desperate battles as grand entertainment. But this misunderstands the nature of orc psychology. Orcs can absolutely experience fear and demoralization. It simply requires very specific conditions to trigger these responses, conditions that Catachans are uniquely suited to create. Understanding how orcs conceptualize defeat helps explain their vulnerability to Catachan tactics. In orc thinking, you have not truly lost a battle unless you have been completely destroyed or forced to acknowledge the enemy's superiority so thoroughly that returning is pointless. Running away does not constitute defeat because you can always come back later for another go. Being killed is not defeat because at least you died fighting, which is the best outcome an orc can hope for. This psychological framework makes orcs remarkably difficult to break through conventional military pressure. But this framework has a critical vulnerability. It depends on the battle itself being worthwhile. Orcs can accept dying if they die in glorious combat. They can accept running away if they at least got some good fighting in before the retreat. What breaks orc morale is dying without ever getting to fight, being killed by enemies they cannot see or reach, finding their victories Pyrrhic and their defeats humiliating. This is exactly the experience that Catachans engineer. Consider the psychological progression of an orc mob advancing through Catachan-controlled jungle. Initially, the orcs are confident, even enthusiastic. They are going to fight, and fighting is what they live for. The jungle is merely an obstacle to push through on the way to the battle. But as they advance, the first casualties occur. A lead orc triggers a concealed mine and disappears in an explosion that kills several of his fellows. The mob pauses, confused. Where did that come from? Was it a trap? How many more are there? They advance more cautiously now, the edge taken off their enthusiasm. Then the sniping begins. An orc at the rear of the mob jerks and falls, a hole in his skull from a round that came from somewhere in the canopy. The orcs look around frantically, but see nothing. No smoke, no movement, no indication of where the shot originated. They fire their sluggas and shooters randomly into the trees, but hit nothing. Another orc falls, then another. The invisible enemy continues killing them, and they cannot respond. The mob's morale begins to crack. These deaths are not glorious. There is no combat, no test of strength against strength, just sudden death from an enemy who refuses to show himself and fight properly. The orcs keep advancing, but now they are nervous, jumping at shadows, wasting ammunition on phantom threats. The jungle that seemed merely inconvenient now feels actively hostile, every shadow potentially containing death. Then comes the ambush proper. The mob enters what seems like any other clearing, and suddenly fire erupts from three sides. Heavy bolters chew through orc flesh with devastating efficiency. Flamers ignite the vegetation around them, turning the clearing into an inferno. Demolition charges detonate, tossing bodies like broken dolls. The volume of fire is so intense, so perfectly coordinated, that the orcs' numerical advantage means nothing. In seconds, half the mob is dead or dying. The survivors try to charge, to close with the enemy and engage in the close combat where orcs excel. But as they move forward, the fire ceases. By the time they reach the positions from which the Catachans were firing, those positions are empty. The enemy has vanished, leaving only the bodies of dead orcs and the smell of smoke and blood. There is no one to fight, no one to take vengeance upon. Just more empty jungle and the knowledge that somewhere out there, invisible enemies are preparing the next ambush. This cycle repeats multiple times as the orc force advances deeper into the jungle. Each ambush kills more orcs, but more importantly, each ambush erodes their confidence and cohesion. Orcs, who started the mission with enthusiasm, are now sullen and afraid. They no longer laugh and joke as they march. They watch the jungle around them with fearful eyes, knowing that death can come at any moment from any direction. The joy of battle, the fundamental drive that makes orcs what they are, has been replaced by grim determination or even outright fear. This psychological state is anathema to orc nature. Orcs are supposed to love fighting. That is their entire purpose, their biological imperative. but there is no love in what they are experiencing. There is only the grinding terror of waiting for death to strike from the shadows. Even an orc, with all his natural aggression and enthusiasm for violence, can only endure so much of this before his morale breaks. When orc morale does break, the results are dramatic. Individual orcs or small groups begin to desert, slipping away from the main force to try to find their way back to safety. These deserters rarely make it. Catachan snipers and scouts track them, allowing them to get some distance from the main force before killing them or capturing them for interrogation. The bodies are left where they fall, or worse, booby-trapped, so that when other orcs find them and try to recover the bodies, they trigger explosives that claim even more lives. The orcs who remain with the main force become increasingly fractious. Arguments break out over which direction to proceed, whether to continue the advance or retreat, who is to blame for the disaster they find themselves in. Knobs, who would normally keep order through simple physical intimidation, find their authority questioned by boys who have lost faith in their leader's ability to get them out of this nightmare. The internal cohesion that makes an orc mob effective begins to disintegrate. From a Warboss's perspective, watching his force degrade this way is politically disastrous. His reputation depends on his ability to lead successful fights and keep his boys happy. But there is nothing happy about dying slowly to invisible enemies in hostile terrain. Every day the campaign continues, the Warboss's position becomes more precarious. Ambitious knobs start circling, sensing weakness. The Warboss faces the dilemma of pressing forward into conditions that are clearly getting worse, or ordering a retreat that will be seen as an admission of defeat. Often the decision is made for him. At some point, the cumulative casualties and psychological damage reach a critical threshold where the orc force simply fragments. Smaller mobs break away and attempt to withdraw on their own. The central authority of the Warboss collapses as boys stop obeying orders and start looking out for their own survival. What began as an organized military operation degrades into a rout, with scattered groups of orcs trying desperately to escape the jungle, while Catachans hunt them down piecemeal. This is the ultimate Catachan victory condition, not destroying the enemy force entirely, which would be difficult given orc numbers, but breaking it psychologically to the point where it ceases to function as a coherent military threat. The surviving orcs, if any make it out of the jungle, carry with them a profound psychological scar. They have learned that fighting Catachans in their terrain is not a glorious battle, but a nightmare of invisible death. They spread this lesson to other orcs, contributing to the reputation that makes future Warbosses think twice before engaging these Death World warriors. The brilliance of this approach lies in how thoroughly it undermines everything that makes orcs dangerous. Their aggression becomes paralyzed when there is no clear enemy to attack. Their numerical advantage means nothing when they can be killed piecemeal. Their robust morale cracks when death comes without honor or glory. Catachans do not defeat orcs through superior firepower or tactical brilliance in conventional terms. They defeat orcs by denying them the experience of battle itself, replacing the joy of combat with the terror of being hunted. The reputation factor. In orc culture, reputation matters profoundly. The stories that circulate through greenskin society shape how individual orcs and entire warbands perceive the galaxy and their place in it. A warrior or enemy spoken of in fearful whispers carries psychological weight that transcends any single encounter. Understanding how Catachans have built their reputation within orc society reveals why even Warbosses, who have never personally faced jungle fighters, learn to give them a wide berth. Orc culture is fundamentally oral. They do not maintain extensive written records or historical archives. Instead, knowledge passes from generation to generation through storytelling, through the tales that orcs tell each other around campfires or in the lulls between battles. The best stories, the most dramatic and memorable ones, spread rapidly through orc society, carried by traveling freebooters, passed between tribes during gatherings, incorporated into the collective memory of the species. The stories about Catachans have a particular character that makes them spread effectively through this oral tradition. They are visceral, describing death in vivid detail. They are mysterious, featuring enemies who strike from nowhere and disappear like ghosts. They are humbling, showing even the biggest and toughest orcs brought low by human soldiers who should be easy prey. These narrative elements give Catachan stories a mimetic stickiness that ensures their propagation through orc culture. Consider a hypothetical but representative example. A warboss leads a war against an imperial world, expecting an easy conquest. His scouts report that the primary defenders are human infantry from a world called Catachan. The warboss has never heard of this world, assumes these are ordinary humans, and orders a standard assault. His forces enter jungle terrain in pursuit of these humans, confident in their ability to crush resistance through superior numbers and aggression. Then the dying begins. Orcs disappear in explosions as they trigger hidden mines. Snipers kill from impossible ranges, hitting knobs and warbosses with envenomed rounds that cause lingering, painful deaths. Entire mobs walk into ambushes where fire erupts from all sides, killing dozens before ceasing abruptly as the Catachans fade back into the jungle. The orcs push forward, but every advance costs more lives, and they never seem to catch the enemy, never get the satisfaction of close combat where orc superiority should tell. The warg that was supposed to be a glorious romp becomes a nightmare campaign that drags on for weeks. Orc morale deteriorates. The warboss faces challenges to his authority. Eventually, either through attrition or demoralization, the orc force breaks and withdraws, having accomplished nothing and lost a significant portion of their strength. The survivors carry their experience back to their tribes, and the stories begin to spread. In the retelling, these stories become more elaborate and more frightening. The Catachans grow from skilled soldiers into supernatural killers. Their stealth becomes magical invisibility. Their ambushes become unstoppable death traps. The fear that the orcs felt in the moment amplifies in memory and in the retelling, creating a legend that exceeds the reality, but effectively deters future engagements. Other warbosses hear these stories. They may discount them initially, assuming that the warboss who led the failed campaign was simply weak or stupid. But when multiple stories circulate, when different warbosses from different tribes all report similar experiences fighting Catachans, a pattern emerges. The smart warbosses, the cunning ones who think more than one step ahead, begin to recognize that this is not a matter of individual weakness, but of facing an enemy that counters orc tactics effectively. The reputation snowballs over time. Each unsuccessful engagement with Catachans adds to the collective knowledge. Orc veterans who survived encounters with jungle fighters pass on their experience to younger orcs. Warbosses who prudently avoid engaging Catachans in jungle terrain survive longer and prosper, while those who charge blindly at these enemies tend to end up dead or deposed. This creates a form of cultural selection where the lesson, avoid fighting Catachans in their terrain, becomes embedded in orc strategic thinking. The fear factor cannot be underestimated. Orcs respect strength and despise weakness, but they also possess enough survival instinct to recognize genuine threats. An enemy that consistently defeats orc forces, that kills without being killed, that transforms confident warriors into frightened survivors, earns a respect born of rational fear. Catachans have earned this respect through decades of successful operations against greenskin forces. This reputation creates a strategic advantage that extends beyond any single battlefield. When Imperial commanders deploy Catachan regiments, they are not just deploying skilled soldiers, they are deploying a psychological weapon that may cause orc forces to hesitate, to seek easier targets, to deploy their strength elsewhere. In some cases, the mere presence of Catachans in a sector may be enough to redirect an orc war toward different objectives, sparing worlds that would otherwise face invasion. The reputation also affects how Catachans are treated when they do engage orcs. Enemy commanders, aware of the jungle fighters' capabilities, may approach encounters with excessive caution, deploying more force than strictly necessary, avoiding terrain where Catachans excel. This tactical respect, born from reputation, gives Catachans additional operational flexibility because enemies overestimate their numbers or capabilities and adjust their plans accordingly. Interestingly, the reputation cuts both ways. Just as orcs learn to fear Catachans, the jungle fighters are aware of their reputation and actively cultivate it. They understand that psychological warfare is as important as kinetic warfare, that an enemy who expects death from shadows is already half defeated before battle is joined. Catachan operations sometimes include deliberate acts designed to enhance their fearsome reputation, leaving survivors who will spread terrifying stories, staging bodies in ways that send messages about their capabilities and ruthlessness. The legend of Sly Marbo exemplifies how individual reputations can amplify force-wide effects. Marbo's exploits, real and exaggerated, have made him a boogeyman figure in orc culture. Some orc tribes tell stories of the Shadow Humi, who can appear anywhere, kill anyone, and cannot be stopped or defeated. When orcs learn that Marbo is operating in their sector, morale takes a hit simply from the knowledge that this legendary killer might be targeting them. Whether Marbo is actually present or not becomes almost irrelevant. The belief that he might be is enough to undermine confidence. This psychological dimension of warfare represents sophisticated thinking that belies the orcs' reputation as simple brutes. The smartest warbosses understand that confidence is a resource, that morale matters, that an army that expects to win fights harder than an army convinced of inevitable defeat. When orcs learn that they will be fighting Catachans in jungle terrain, that expectation of victory evaporates. They have heard the stories. They know what happened to other orcs who made that fight. And knowing this, they become less effective warriors even before the first shot is fired. From a grand strategic perspective, the reputation that Catachans have built becomes force multiplication at the theatre level. One Catachan regiment, operating in a jungle environment, ties down and demoralizes orc forces that vastly outnumber them, not through superior firepower, but through the psychological weight of their reputation. Other Imperial forces can operate more effectively elsewhere because orc attention and resources are focused on the threat that Catachans represent, even if that threat is more psychological than material. The long-term effect has been to create an interesting dynamic in orc strategic planning. When a warboss surveys potential targets for his next warg, he evaluates not just military strength, but the nature of the defenses. A heavily fortified world defended by conventional Imperial Guard regiments might be attacked with enthusiasm because orcs understand how to fight that kind of battle. A more lightly defended world that happens to have Catachan regiments stationed in its jungles might be avoided entirely because the warboss knows from stories and reputation that the costs of conquest would outweigh the benefits. This represents perhaps the greatest testament to Catachan effectiveness. They have altered orcs' strategic calculus at a fundamental level. They have taught a species that lives for war, that considers fighting the highest calling, that some fights are better avoided. This lesson, passed through orc culture as stories and warnings, ensures that future generations of orcs will continue to give Catachans the respect born of hard experience, even as new warbosses rise who have never personally faced these death world warriors. Exceptions, and when orcs do fight, Catachans. Despite everything we have discussed about why orc warbosses generally avoid engaging Catachan forces in jungle terrain, we must acknowledge that such engagements do occur. Understanding the circumstances that lead orcs to fight Catachans, despite the unfavorable odds, provides important context, and prevents us from oversimplifying the dynamic between these forces. The galaxy is vast, warfare is complex, and even the most rational strategic calculations sometimes give way to necessity or to the fundamental irrationality of combat. The most common circumstance forcing orcs to engage Catachans is simple strategic necessity. If Catachans control a critical objective that the orcs must secure, if they block a vital supply line or transportation route, if they threaten the orcs' rear areas or support infrastructure, a warboss may determine that fighting them is unavoidable, regardless of the expected costs. In these situations, the calculation changes from whether to engage to how to minimize casualties while achieving the objective. Massive numerical superiority can also motivate orc attacks. A warboss commanding a truly enormous war might conclude that even accepting heavy casualties against Catachans, his force remains capable of overwhelming them through sheer weight of numbers. This calculation is not always wrong. Catachans are supremely skilled and dangerous, but they are not infinite. A determined orc assault, backed by thousands or tens of thousands of boys, can eventually overcome even the most sophisticated Catachan defenses, though the body count will be staggering. The Dulmalin cleansing provides an example of this dynamic. The orc forces on that world vastly outnumbered the single Catachan regiment that survived planetfall. Had the orcs been able to bring their full strength to bear simultaneously, they might have overwhelmed Colonel Strachan's command through attrition alone. But the terrain and the Catachan's guerrilla tactics prevented the orcs from concentrating their forces effectively, allowing the jungle fighters to survive a year-long campaign that by all rights should have annihilated them. Some warbosses are simply too stupid or too confident to learn the lessons that others have internalized. Orc culture rewards aggression and punishes apparent cowardice. A warboss who has achieved success through brute force tactics in other theaters may believe that he can succeed where others failed, that his boys are tougher, his leadership stronger, his wah more potent. These overconfident warbosses often charge into combat with Catachans convinced that reputation and stories do not apply to them. They are usually proven wrong, but by the time they realize their mistake, they have already committed their forces and casualties mount quickly. The distinction between feral orcs and more organized greenskin forces matters significantly in this context. Feral orcs, who live in primitive tribal conditions and lack the organization and equipment of their more advanced cousins, fight Catachans more regularly because they often inhabit similar environments. When Imperial forces deploy to jungle worlds already infested with feral orcs, confrontation becomes inevitable. These engagements follow different patterns than battles against organized war forces, because feral orcs lack the sophisticated tactical thinking that might lead them to avoid unfavorable engagements. However, even feral orcs learn through experience. The feral orc populations in Armageddon's equatorial jungles initially saw Catachan deployment as merely another type of human prey to hunt. After several catastrophic encounters, where the hunters became the hunted, where entire feral orc tribes were exterminated by jungle fighters operating in their terrain, the survivors learned caution. They still fought Catachans when encounters occurred because feral orcs live in those jungles and cannot simply leave, but they approached such fights with wariness rather than eagerness. Certain particularly brutal or aggressive orc clans place less emphasis on the tactical calculations that might otherwise dissuade them from attacking Catachans. The Goth clan, known for being the biggest, meanest, and most combat-focused orcs in the galaxy, sometimes engage Catachans out of sheer belligerence. To a Goth warboss, the reputation for toughness that comes from successfully fighting Catachans might outweigh the expected casualties. These clans view difficult battles as opportunities to prove their superior toughness rather than as fights to avoid. Similarly, Blood Axe orcs, known for their relative cunning and willingness to adopt tactics from other species, might actually seek out engagements with Catachans as learning opportunities. A Bloodaxe warboss might study how jungle fighters operate, attempt to copy their tactics, and test his boys against these skilled warriors to prepare them for future campaigns. This does not mean the Bloodaxes will win these engagements, but their motivation differs from simple conquest and might lead them to accept unfavorable fights for the sake of gaining tactical experience. The cost of victory, even when orcs do succeed against Catachans, deserves examination. In the rare cases where orcs defeat Catachan forces through overwhelming numbers or fortunate circumstances, they typically find the victory Pyrrhic. The casualties suffered during the campaign far exceed those from comparable operations against other Imperial forces. The time required to secure objectives stretches operational timelines beyond acceptable limits. The survivors are demoralized and less effective in subsequent battles. And critically, the orcs often discover that defeating a Catachan force does not actually eliminate the threat. Catachans are masters of strategic withdrawal and guerrilla continuation. Even when forced from their positions, even when ostensibly defeated, jungle fighters simply melt into the terrain and continue operations from new bases. They ambush supply lines, bringing reinforcements to the orcs' newly won positions. They snipe at sentries and commanders, making occupation a daily nightmare. They poison water sources and rig unexploded ordnance to detonate when disturbed. The orcs may hold the ground, but they pay continuously for that privilege, bleeding personnel and morale until the position becomes untenable. This inability to achieve clean victory against Catachans frustrates orc strategic planning. In orc warfare, taking an objective means the fighting there is finished, and you can move on to the next target. Against Catachans, taking the objective is often just the beginning of a long, grinding defensive battle, where the orcs must maintain control against an enemy who refuses to accept defeat. This ties up forces that could be used elsewhere and turns what should be triumphs into burdens. Environmental circumstances also force engagements that orcs might prefer to avoid. If an orc invasion fleet makes planetfall on a world they believe is lightly defended, only to discover that Catachan regiments are present in force and operating from the planet's jungle regions, the warboss faces difficult choices. Withdrawing entirely wastes the resources invested in reaching the planet and damages the warboss's reputation. But pressing forward means fighting on unfavorable terms. Often, the warboss compromises, securing objectives in the more open terrain while avoiding the jungles where Catachans dominate, accepting an incomplete conquest rather than risking his forces in environments where they cannot fight effectively. Finally, we must acknowledge that sometimes engagements occur through simple misfortune or miscommunication. An orc patrol stumbles into Catachan positions without meaning to, and suddenly both forces are committed to combat, whether they wanted it or not. An unexpected encounter in terrain neither side selected can lead to battles where the usual advantages and disadvantages do not fully apply. These chance encounters are typically brief and brutal, with both sides taking casualties before breaking contact, neither achieving a decisive result, but both learning respect for their opponent's capabilities. The existence of these exceptions does not invalidate the general pattern of orc avoidance of Catachan forces in jungle warfare. Rather, they illustrate the complexity of strategic decision-making in a galaxy where thousands of variables influence outcomes. Sometimes even the best calculations prove insufficient. Sometimes circumstances override planning. Sometimes leaders make poor decisions despite having good information. The fact that orcs occasionally fight Catachans in unfavorable conditions does not mean they enjoy it or seek it out, merely that warfare's chaos sometimes produces engagements that nobody wanted, but everyone must fight. Conclusion: respect through fear. The phenomenon of orc warbosses avoiding direct confrontation with Catachan jungle fighters represents something rare and significant in the grim darkness of the far future. It is a case study in how even the most aggressive, war-obsessed species in the galaxy can be taught caution through bitter experience. It demonstrates that reputation and psychological warfare can achieve what firepower alone cannot. Most importantly, it reveals fundamental truths about both the nature of orc psychology and the extraordinary capabilities of humans forged in the most hostile environment the Imperium has to offer. At its core, the orc-Catachan dynamic illustrates that intelligence, even in a species like the orcs, where it often seems absent, manifests in the form of successful warbosses who survive and prosper while their less capable rivals fall to challenges or to enemy action. These successful warbosses have learned through direct experience or through the accumulated wisdom of their culture that fighting Catachans in jungle terrain represents a losing proposition. They have internalized the lesson that some enemies, in some environments, are better avoided when alternative targets present themselves. This is not cowardice. It is rational strategic thinking applied within the framework of orc psychology and motivations. The Catachans, for their part, have achieved something remarkable. They have built a reputation so fearsome, proven their capabilities so thoroughly, that they have altered the behavior of an enemy that should be utterly undeterred by reputation alone. Orcs are not supposed to care about stories or worry about difficult battles. Yet Catachans have made them care, have made them worry, through the simple expedient of consistently making those difficult battles so costly and frustrating that orc leaders prefer to find easier prey. This achievement rests on multiple factors working in concert. The brutal natural selection of Catachan produces warriors of exceptional capability, both physically and mentally. These warriors are then deployed into environments where their lifetime of experience translates directly into combat effectiveness. They employ tactics specifically designed to neutralize orc advantages while exploiting orc weaknesses. They cultivate a fearsome reputation that precedes them into battle and undermines enemy morale before fighting even begins. And most importantly, they do all of this while remaining baseline humans, without genetic enhancement or exotic technology, proving that human adaptability and determination can triumph over seemingly superior enemies. The lessons here extend beyond the specific case of Catachans versus orcs. The Imperium contains countless worlds, innumerable regiments, and endless variety in how humanity wages war across the stars. What Catachans demonstrate is that specialization matters, that soldiers, perfectly adapted to specific environments, can achieve effects far beyond what their numbers or equipment would suggest. A Catachan regiment, deployed to a jungle death world, becomes a force multiplier far more effective than sending 10 regiments of line infantry to the same location. The Departamento Munitorum, for all its bureaucratic inefficiency, understands this principle and deploys Catachans accordingly. But there is a darker implication as well. The Imperium's reliance on specialists like Catachans reveals its fundamental weakness. Humanity survives in the galaxy not through having the best soldiers or the most advanced technology, but through sheer diversity and adaptability. Every threat, every environment, every enemy has a counter somewhere in the Imperium's vast military apparatus. Catachans counter jungle-fighting orcs. Vostroyans excel in frozen wastelands. Cadians dominate in conventional warfare. Talon tank companies rule the deserts. But this diversity is reactive rather than proactive, a response to threats rather than a solution to them. Humanity endures by having an answer to every question, but not by having a universal answer. For orcs, the existence of Catachans as a deterrent force introduces a level of strategic complexity to their planning that is both surprising and evolutionarily significant. It suggests that orc culture is capable of more sophisticated thinking than it is often credited with, at least at the highest levels of leadership. The transmission of tactical wisdom through oral tradition, the development of reputational awareness, the ability to make cost-benefit analyses even within a framework of biologically mandated aggression. These capabilities indicate that orcs are more dangerous than simple brutes because they can learn and adapt as a species. This adaptability works in both directions. Just as warbosses learn to avoid fighting Catachans in unfavorable terrain, They also learn which tactics work against other enemies, which battlefields favor their strengths, where to direct their wows for maximum effect and minimum cost. The Imperium benefits from orcs being largely disorganized and prone to infighting, but the existence of cunning warbosses who make rational strategic decisions suggests that if the orcs ever achieve true unity, if a sufficiently brilliant warlord united the entire species, they would represent an extinction-level threat to humanity. The practical implications for Imperial military planning are clear. Catachan regiments should be deployed where their capabilities can be maximized, in jungle environments, against enemies susceptible to guerrilla tactics. Wasting these elite soldiers in conventional warfare, where their specialization provides no advantage, is criminally inefficient. Similarly, understanding enemy psychology and exploiting psychological vulnerabilities through reputation and fear can achieve strategic effects without firing a shot. An enemy that avoids you out of fear is defeated without battle, freeing your forces for deployment elsewhere. For those who study the art of war, whether in the 41st millennium or in any era, the Catachan-orc dynamic provides valuable lessons. Environment matters profoundly in warfare, shaping what tactics are viable and which forces will prevail. Psychological factors, including morale, reputation, and fear, can be as decisive as firepower and numerical advantage. Specialized forces tailored to specific environments and enemies can achieve disproportionate effects. And perhaps most importantly, no enemy is invincible, no advantage permanent, no reputation unearned. Everything can be countered with sufficient intelligence, preparation, and willingness to adapt. As we look to the grim darkness of the far future, where war is the only constant and survival hangs always in the balance, we find in the Catachan jungle fighters a model of what humanity can achieve through determination, adaptability, and refusal to accept defeat. These Deathworld warriors, born in one of the most hostile environments humanity has ever tried to tame, have become masters of their craft and earned the respect of enemies who should fear nothing. They stand as testament to the principle that in the Emperor's Imperium, there is always a weapon suited to every foe, always a regiment capable of achieving the impossible, always humans willing to face any horror in defense of their species. The orcs may be the most warlike species in the galaxy, living only for battle and dying without regret. But even they have learned that some battles are better avoided, some enemies too costly to engage, some humans too dangerous to fight in the environments where they excel. The Catachan jungle fighters have written this lesson in blood across 100 worlds, and in doing so, they have proven that human ingenuity, courage, and sheer stubborn refusal to die can triumph over biological imperatives engineered by ancient alien minds. That is perhaps the most important lesson of all. In a galaxy where humanity should have gone extinct long ago, but somehow, against all odds, continues to survive. If you enjoyed learning about why the galaxy's most aggressive species has learned to give these Deathworld warriors a wide berth, please like and subscribe to the channel. There are countless more stories from the 41st millennium waiting to be explored, each revealing new facets of the endless war for humanity's survival among the stars. The Emperor protects, but as the Catachans prove, sometimes the Emperor's protection comes in the form of exceptionally skilled killers who refuse to let their enemies fight the war they want to fight. Until next time, remain vigilant, trust in your training, and remember that in the jungles of Catachan, every day is a battle just to survive, and those who survive that crucible become weapons that even orcs have learned to fear.